The air at the Miller place hung thick and heavy, smelling of diesel exhaust, stale beer, and desperation. It was the smell of a farm dying. The auctioneer's rhythmic chant, a hypnotic cadence of financial ruin, echoed off the peeling paint of the main barn. Men stood in tight knots, hands in their pockets, ball caps pulled low. They weren't here to buy, not really. They were here to watch, to bear witness, to feel the cold shudder of fear that it could just as easily be their own lives scattered across the lawn for strangers to pick over. I stood near the back, leaning against the rusty fender of my Ford F-250, the one with the 390 V8 that drank gas but would pull a house off its foundation. I watched as Tom Miller's life was dismantled piece by piece, his tools, his grain augers, his livestock feeders. Each crack of the gavel was like a nail being hammered into a coffin. And now they'd come to the heart of it. Sitting in the center of the yard, like a beached red whale, was the combine. A Gleaner N6, barely 3 years old. It was a monster of a machine, with a hydrostatic transmission, a 6-row corn head, and an air-conditioned cab that looked like the cockpit of a spaceship. It was the kind of machine that magazines wrote articles about. The kind of machine that promised you could farm 1,000 acres by yourself and still be home for supper. It was also the kind of machine that came with a banknote the size of a telephone book. The auctioneer, a slick man named Henderson with a voice like gravel being poured into a tin bucket, started the bidding. He sang its praises, talking about its capacity, its low hours, its clean condition. But the crowd was quiet. The bids came slow and low, like reluctant confessions. These men knew the truth. That machine wasn't just a combine, it was a symbol. It was a monument to the idea that you could borrow your way to prosperity. And right now, it was an anchor that had pulled Tom Miller and his family straight to the bottom. Then I saw him. Richard Peterson. Rich, as everyone called him, he wasn't bidding. He was just standing there by his brand-new Lincoln Continental, arms crossed over his chest, a smug little smile playing on his lips. Rich was the new breed. He'd inherited a good piece of ground from his old man, same as me, but that's where the similarities ended. He saw farming as a numbers game, a corporate takeover of the soil. He'd been the one who'd outbid Tom on that rented 80 acres last spring, the piece Tom had been counting on to make the payment on that very combine. Rich hadn't needed the land, not really. He just couldn't stand to see anyone else have it. He caught my eye and gave me a little nod, the kind of gesture a king gives a peasant. I just stared back. I knew what he was thinking. He was looking at me, at my worn denim jacket and my work-stained hands, and seeing a dinosaur, a relic. In his world of high-interest loans and massive expansion, a man like me, a man who refused to owe a single soul a single red cent, was an impossibility, a fool. My father's voice echoed in my head, as clear as if he were standing next to me. He'd lived through the 30s, had seen his own father lose everything to the banks and the dust. Earl, he'd told me 100 times, his voice rough as a cob. Never let another man own your sweat. If you can't hold the cash for it in your hand, you can't afford it. Debt is a yoke, son. It'll feel light at first, but it'll grind you into the dirt before you're through. I lived by those words. My farm wasn't the biggest in the county. It wasn't the prettiest. But it was mine. Every fence post, every shingle on the barn roof, every bolt in the engine of my tractor. I'd paid for it all with cash, earned through sweat and long hours. My main tractor was a 1968 John Deere 4020, the one with the side console synchro range transmission. She wasn't new, but that diesel engine was the most dependable thing I'd ever known. For lighter work, I had my dad's old Farmall M, its narrow front end a testament to a different era. And for harvest, I had my own combine, a John Deere 95 with a round back body. It was an old machine, sure. It didn't have an air-conditioned cab. The dust and the chaff swirled around you all day until you were caked in a layer of grime. It only took 4 rows of corn at a time, but I knew every inch of it. I'd rebuilt the variable speed drive myself, knew the particular growl the engine made when the separator was under a heavy load. It was mine. It didn't belong to the bank in town. It didn't own me. Rich sauntered over, his fancy leather boots looking ridiculous in the muddy farmyard. "Quite a show, huh, Earl?" he said, gesturing at the Gleaner. "Shame what happens when a man's ambition gets bigger than his wallet." "It's a shame, all right, Rich," I said, my voice low and even. "Still running that old museum piece of yours?" He chuckled. "That little 95? How many acres you figure you can get in a day with that thing? 20? 30 if the wind's at your back?" "It gets the job done," I said, not giving him the satisfaction of an argument. "Yeah, well, the job is getting bigger," he said, puffing out his chest. "I just picked up another quarter section over by the river. My new International 1460 will chew through that in 2 days. You got to keep up, Earl. This is the 70s. You can't farm like it's 1950 anymore. You got to leverage, use the bank's money to make your own." He didn't get it. He saw my old iron as a weakness, a sign of poverty. He couldn't understand that it was my armor. Every piece of paid-for equipment was a stone in the fortress I'd built around my family, a defense against days exactly like this one. The bidding on the Gleaner stalled out, thousands below what Tom still owed on it. The silence stretched. Henderson, the auctioneer, tried to work the crowd, but it was no use. The air was too heavy. You could see Tom Miller's wife, Sarah, standing by the porch, her face pale, her hands twisting the fabric of her apron. She was trying not to cry, but her shoulders were shaking. Their whole life, their whole future, was sitting there in that yard. And it wasn't enough. It would never be enough to satisfy the bank. The silence was the worst part, the silence after the last final bid. The silence that said, "It's over." In that quiet, you could hear the death of a dream. Before we get into what happened in the years that followed that awful day, I have to ask you folks, have you ever been to one of those auctions? Have you ever had to stand there and watch a neighbor, a friend, lose everything they'd ever worked for? Let me know down in the comments, because what I saw happened to Tom Miller that day. It was just the first tremor before the earthquake. The next couple of years were a grind. The price of corn was decent, but not great. The price of fuel and parts, though, that just kept climbing. I put in my crops, I worked the fields, and I kept my head down. Rich Peterson, on the other hand, was flying high. He was buying land like it was going out of style, and every time you saw him, he was on a new piece of equipment. His farm was starting to look less like a farm and more like a dealer's lot. For me, harvest that next fall came on hot and dry. I'd spent the last week in the shop getting the old 95 ready. I'd changed the oil in the 303 diesel engine, greased every Zerk fitting I could find, and there were dozens of them, and sharpened the sickles on the corn head. She was running sweet. The familiar clatter and hum of the machine was a comforting sound. I was about halfway through a 160-acre field of corn, the dust boiling up behind me, the sun beating down on the cab roof. The bins were filling up with good, dry corn. It was one of those days where you feel like you're doing what you were put on this earth to do. And then it happened. It started as a slight vibration, a tremor I felt more through the seat of my pants than heard with my ears. I knew my machine, I knew every sound it made. This was a new one. I throttled back the engine, listening intently over the whirring of the belts and chains. The vibration got worse. It became a low growl, then a high-pitched whine that set my teeth on edge. I slammed the lever to disengage the separator and shut down the engine in one motion. The sudden silence was deafening. The only sound was the ticking of the hot engine and the rustle of the cornstalks in the wind. I knew, with a sinking feeling in the pit of my stomach, that this was bad. This wasn't a slipped belt or a clogged auger. This was deep inside the guts of the machine. I climbed down from the operator's platform, my boots sinking into the soft dirt. The smell of hot metal and burnt grease hit me first. I opened the side panel, the one that gave access to the main cylinder. A wisp of blue smoke curled out. I reached in, my hand hovering over the massive bearing housing on the right side. It was hot enough to fry an egg on. The main cylinder bearing. It had let go. My heart sank. That wasn't a field repair, that was a major teardown. The entire cylinder, a massive, heavy steel drum with rasp bars bolted to it, would have to come out. It was a job that would take days, not hours. And I was in the middle of harvest, with the clock ticking. That evening, the farmyard was lit up by 2 halogen work lights I had wired to my portable generator. The John Deere 95 sat there, disemboweled. I'd used my chain hoist, rigged to a heavy beam in the barn, to lift the cylinder out. It was hanging there now, suspended in mid-air, looking like some piece of medieval torture equipment. My hands were black with grease, a deep gash across my knuckles from a wrench that had slipped. I had the old bearing race out. It was scarred and pitted, the metal blued from the intense heat. The ball bearings themselves were gone, likely turned to dust and fragments inside the housing. I sat on an overturned bucket, the greasy parts manual open on my lap, a film of dirt covering the pages. I found the part number. Now came the hard part, finding a replacement. The next morning I was on the phone. Not a cell phone, of course. This was the 70s. I was on the old black rotary phone in the kitchen, its cord stretched tight as I paced back and forth. I called the local John Deere dealer first. The parts guy, a young kid who didn't know a connecting rod from a curtain rod, took a long time. I could hear him flipping through pages. "Nope," he finally said. "That part's been discontinued. We don't have it." I called every dealer, every parts supplier, every salvage yard within 100 miles. Same story. "Sorry, Earl, can't help you. That's an old one. You might try so-and-so over in the next state." As I was on the phone, a cloud of dust came down my lane. It was Rich Peterson in his shiny new pickup. He rolled to a stop, the air conditioning from his truck blasting out into the humid air. He didn't get out. He just leaned his head out the window. "Heard you had a little trouble," he said, a grin on his face. He gestured with his head towards my silent, crippled combine. "That's what happens when you try to run antiques, Earl. Downtime will eat you alive. My 1460 hasn't stopped once, already done with my own beans and starting on the Miller place." He didn't offer to help. He didn't know a guy who might have a part. He was just there to gloat, to rub my nose in my own misfortune. "You know," he said, his voice dripping with false sympathy, "for what you're losing every day that thing sits here, you could make a hell of a down payment on a new machine." "I'll get her running," I said through gritted teeth. He just laughed. "Sure you will, Earl, sure you will." And with a roar of his engine, he was gone, leaving me standing there in another cloud of dust, feeling smaller than I ever had in my life. The talk started at the co-op, at the diner in town. "Did you hear about Earl? His old combine finally gave up the ghost. He's going to lose half his crop if he doesn't get it in the ground soon." Stubborn old fool, should have traded that thing in years ago. The words were like little cuts, each one stinging more than the last. They saw my struggle not as a testament to my resolve, but as proof of my failure. Finally, after 2 days of calls, I found it. A salvage yard 3 counties away. The old man who ran it knew exactly what I was talking about. "Yeah, got one here off a 95 we scrapped last year. Bearing's still good. I'll sell it to you." It felt like a miracle. I didn't even ask the price. I just told him I was on my way. I lost another half a day driving there and back, but I had it. A heavy, greasy, beautiful steel bearing. I worked all through that night, under the harsh glare of the work lights. The generator hummed, a lonely sound in the dark. It was a slow, painstaking process, lining up the massive cylinder, carefully pressing the new bearing into place, retensioning the belts. My muscles ached, my eyes burned from exhaustion, but I kept going. Just before dawn, as the first hint of grey lightened the eastern sky, I was done. I put the last shield back in place, my hands shaking with fatigue. I climbed up into the operator's seat, took a deep breath, and turned the key. The starter groaned, and then the old 303 diesel coughed to life, settling into its familiar, rumbling idle. I engaged the separator. It whirred smoothly. No vibration, no grinding. Just the clean, powerful hum of a machine ready to work. I had never heard a more beautiful sound in my entire life. I hadn't beaten the machine. We had beaten the problem together. A storm was forecast for the end of the week. I didn't have any time to waste. I pushed that old combine and myself to the absolute limit for the next 3 days, but I got every last kernel out of that field before the first drops of rain began to fall. I had won. It was a brutal, exhausting, soul-crushing victory, but it was mine. The next few years were like a dream for men like Rich Peterson. In 1972, the Soviet Union, facing a disastrous harvest of their own, secretly bought up nearly a quarter of the entire US wheat crop. They called it the Great Grain Robbery, and it sent commodity prices into the stratosphere. Corn went from $1.25 a bushel to over $3. Soybeans doubled. All of a sudden, farming wasn't about breaking even anymore. It was a gold rush. The government, the banks, the farm magazines. They all had the same message: get big or get out. Plant fence row to fence row. Land that had been selling for $500 an acre was suddenly $1,000, then $2,000. And the banks were handing out money like it was candy at a parade. Rich Peterson was in heaven. He was born for this moment. His entire philosophy of leveraging debt was paying off in spades. He bought the old Miller farm outright. Then he bought the 80 acres next to it. He traded in his already massive International 1460 on a brand new 1480, a machine so big it looked like it could harvest a whole county in an afternoon. He built a new ranch-style house for his wife, with a 2-car garage and a paved driveway. Next to it, he erected a steel machine shed that was bigger than my entire barn. It had a concrete floor, fluorescent lights, and a heated workshop. He was the king of the county, the poster boy for the modern, aggressive farmer. A reporter from a big farm journal came out and did a story on him, with a picture of Rich leaning against the front tire of his new combine, smiling like he'd just invented dirt. I read the article at the diner. "You can't be scared of debt," he was quoted as saying. "Debt is a tool. The old ways of scrimping and saving, they just don't cut it in today's market." I felt the eyes of the other farmers on me as I read it. They all knew who he was talking about. I was the old way, the dinosaur. The boom was good for me too. I'm not going to lie, those were some profitable years. With corn at $3 a bushel, even my modest acreage was bringing in serious money. For the first time in my life, I had a surplus, a real cushion in the bank. The temptation was there, whispering in my ear every single day. The 80 acres bordering my north fence came up for sale. The bank president himself, Mr. Abernathy, called me at home. "Earl, you need to buy that piece," he said, his voice smooth and persuasive. "It's a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. We can work out the financing, no problem. At these prices, it'll pay for itself in 5 years." It was tempting. God, it was tempting. I could almost feel the satisfaction of ploughing that new ground. But then I'd hear my father's voice. I'd see the ghost of Tom Miller standing in his yard, watching his life get sold off. And I'd look at Rich Peterson, at the frantic pace of his expansion, and it didn't look like success to me. It looked like a man running a race on a treadmill, going faster and faster, but never getting anywhere, terrified to stop. So I didn't buy the land. Rich did, of course, paying a price that made my head spin. I didn't buy a new combine or a new tractor. Instead, I took that money and I fortified my position. I paid my property taxes 5 years in advance. I bought a brand new set of Firestone field and road tires for the 4020 and had the injectors rebuilt. I spent a whole summer putting in new drainage tile in my lowest, wettest field. A back-breaking job, but one that would pay dividends for decades. I found a low-mileage C60 grain truck at a state auction and spent the winter rebuilding its 366 V8 engine, bolt by bolt. To everyone else, it looked like I was burying my money in the ground. "Can you believe Earl?" I'd hear them say. "Sitting on a pile of cash and he's still tinkering with that old junk. He's afraid to make a move." They saw it as fear. I saw it as discipline. They thought I was standing still, but I was sinking my roots deeper into the ground I already owned. One afternoon in the late fall of '79, I was at the bank making a deposit. The whole place felt different. The old cautious atmosphere was gone. It was replaced by a giddy, frantic energy. Mr. Abernathy saw me and came right over, slapping me on the back. "Earl, good to see you. Still not ready to expand? Land prices are up another 10% this quarter. You're missing the boat, my friend." I just smiled and shook my head. "I'm happy with what I've got, Mr. Abernathy." He sighed dramatically. "You old-timers, can't teach you new tricks." As I left, my eyes fell on the big board behind the tellers that listed the current interest rates. I remembered when a farm loan was 6, maybe 7%. The number next to operating loans was 12%. The number next to mortgages was 14. The numbers had been creeping up so slowly you barely noticed, but now, seeing them in black and white, it was a shock. I got into my old Ford and turned the key. The radio was on, and a newsman was talking in a grave voice about the new chairman of the Federal Reserve, a man named Paul Volcker. He was talking about a war on inflation, about tightening the money supply, about something called a prime rate that was going to go up. I didn't understand all the financial talk, but I understood the tone of his voice. It was the sound of a party ending. That evening, as the sun went down, I stood on my back porch, looking out over my fields. The corn was harvested, the ground chiseled and ready for winter. The air was crisp and clean. Across the valley, I could see the lights of Rich Peterson's farm. His massive new machine shed was lit up like a stadium, the glow of it blotting out the stars. It looked so impressive, so modern, so powerful. A monument to the new age of farming, but I felt a cold dread creep up my spine that had nothing to do with the autumn chill. For years, the silence of my own farm, the quiet hum of a debt-free operation, had been a comfort. It was the sound of peace, of security. But tonight it sounded different. It sounded like the deep, heavy quiet of the world holding its breath, waiting for the storm to break. The first sign that the world was tilting on its axis came not as a thunderclap, but as a long, dry silence from the sky. The spring of 1980 was brittle. The rains that should have come in April and May never arrived. The ground hardened into something resembling terracotta, and the young corn stalks, which should have been knee-high by June, were spindly and pale, their leaves curled tight like desperate thirsty tongues. The air grew thick with a fine yellow dust that coated everything and got into the back of your throat. It was the kind of weather that made old men stare at the horizon and mutter about the 30s. For me, the drought was a hardship. It meant lower yields, a tightening of the belt. For Rich Peterson, it was a catastrophe. His operation was built on massive yields. His loan payments were calculated on $3 corn and 200 bushel averages. Every day without rain was another turn of the screw, the pressure building behind his eyes. You could see it at the diner. He stopped joking with the waitress. He just sat there, stirring his coffee, staring out the window at the brassy, unforgiving sky. Then, during the fall harvest of that stunted, miserable crop, his new combine broke down. It wasn't a simple bearing like mine had been. I was working on my grain truck when one of his hired men, a kid barely out of high school, came tearing into my yard, his face pale with panic. "Earl, you gotta come help," he stammered. "The big combine, she just quit. Rich is fit to be tied." I wiped my hands on a rag and drove my pickup over. The International 1480 was sitting silent in the middle of a cornfield, a giant red monument to frustration. Rich was standing beside it, kicking one of the enormous rear tires, his face the color of a ripe plum. "What's she doing, Rich?" I asked, keeping my voice calm. "She's not doing a damn thing," he spat. "Just died. All the lights on the console went out, engine shut down, and that's it. Won't even turn over." I wasn't an international man, but I knew my way around a diesel engine. I climbed up into the cab. It was like sitting in an airplane. Wires ran everywhere, feeding a complex electronic monitoring system with a dozen different sensors and warning lights. It was supposed to be foolproof. I checked the basics: fuel, battery connections. They were fine. I found the main fuse panel, a maze of plastic and copper. Nothing looked blown. "It's the black box," Rich said, his voice ragged. "It's got to be. One of the main computer modules." He was right. This wasn't a mechanical problem. It was an electrical one, buried deep in the machine's electronic brain. It wasn't something you could fix with a wrench and a pry bar. You needed a dealer technician with a briefcase full of diagnostic equipment that cost more than my first tractor. "You call the dealer?" I asked. "Of course I called the dealer," he yelled. "They can't get a man out here till Friday." "Friday? I've got 500 acres of corn left to cut, and the bank payment is due on the 1st. He sank down and put his head in his hands. For the first time, I didn't see the arrogant king of the county. I saw a man trapped in a cage he had built for himself, and the walls were closing in. The technician came on Friday, just as he'd said. He spent half a day hooking up his meters and testers, and finally pinpointed the problem: a fried circuit board in the main engine controller. The part had to be ordered from the regional depot. It would take another 3 days. The bill for the service call and the part came to just over $2,000. $2,000 for a piece of plastic and wire the size of a shoebox lid. Rich wrote the check, his hand shaking. He lost a week of perfect harvesting weather. By the time he got the machine running again, a wet, miserable front had moved in. And he spent the rest of the season fighting mud, his tires carving deep ruts into the fields, the wet grain costing him a fortune in drying fees at the elevator. That single breakdown, that one little black box, had cost him tens of thousands of dollars in lost time, dockage, and repair bills. It was the first crack in the dam, and the water was starting to seep through. The trickle became a flood. In January of 1980, President Carter had announced a grain embargo against the Soviet Union. The market, which had been artificially inflated for years, collapsed overnight. Corn prices didn't just fall, they plummeted. By the time Rich was trying to sell his rain-damaged, low-test-weight corn, the price was barely $1.50 a bushel, half of what his entire financial plan was based on. But the real killer, the shot to the heart, was the interest rates. Paul Volcker's war on inflation was in full swing. The prime lending rate, which had been a single digit for most of our lives, started climbing like a rocket. 15%, 18%, 20%. It finally peaked at an unbelievable 21.5%. Every loan Rich had, the land, the equipment, his annual operating note, was on a variable rate. The friendly letters from the bank were replaced by stark formal notices. His monthly payments doubled, then tripled. He was trying to pay off a 20th century debt with 19th century prices, and the math was simply impossible. The farm crisis of the 80s wasn't a sudden event. It was a slow, agonizing death by 1,000 cuts. It started with whispers at the co-op. Heard the bank put Rich Peterson on a cash-only basis. Then it was the fuel supplier refusing to deliver until his past due bill was paid. He let his hired man go. His wife, who used to drive into the city for shopping, stopped leaving the farm altogether. The brand-new Lincoln Continental sat in the garage, gathering dust. He started selling off the smaller, non-essential pieces of equipment. A disc, a cultivator, just to raise enough cash to buy seed. I saw him at the bank one afternoon. He was standing at Mr. Abernathy's desk. He wasn't the proud, confident man I knew. He was stooped, thin, his clothes hanging off him. He was pleading. I couldn't hear the words, but I could see the desperation in his posture, the way he wrung his hands. Mr. Abernathy, the same man who had once urged me to get on the boat, was shaking his head, his face a mask of cold, professional regret. He wasn't a partner anymore. He was just a banker, collecting a debt. I kept my own head down. My life didn't change much. I had no interest payments to make. I had my own grain storage, so I wasn't forced to sell on the bottom of the market. I could afford to wait. My old John Deere 4020 sipped diesel compared to his new articulated four-wheel drive, and when something broke, I could fix it myself with parts I either had on the shelf or could get for a reasonable price. The money I'd saved during the good years, the money everyone thought I was foolishly hoarding, became my lifeline. It wasn't a fortune, but it was enough. It meant I could buy my fuel and fertilizer with cash, avoiding the crippling interest on an operating note. The day the auction notice went up on the bulletin board at the courthouse, a hush fell over the whole county. It felt obscene, like reading another man's obituary before he was dead. The list of equipment was staggering: the massive International 1480 combine, the Steiger four-wheel drive tractor, the Kinzer planter. An entire fleet of modern high-capacity machinery. All of it was less than 5 years old. All of it was being sold to satisfy the bank. The day of the auction was cold and grey, a fitting sky for a funeral. It was even bigger than the Miller auction had been. People came from 3 states away. It was a feeding frenzy. Bankers and liquidators walked the rows of equipment, their clipboards and cold eyes assessing every asset. I saw Rich standing by his oversized machine shed, the one that had been his pride and joy. He looked like a ghost. His wife was nowhere to be seen. The auctioneer started, his chant echoing off the big steel building. The prices were heartbreakingly low. The land bust was in full swing, and nobody had any money. Equipment that Rich had paid $100,000 for was selling for 25-30 cents on the dollar. The Steiger tractor, his magnificent beast, sold for less than what he still owed on it. Then they came to the combine. The 1480, the machine with the $2,000 black box. It sat there, gleaming red under the flat grey light. The auctioneer sang its praises, low hours, always shedded, top-of-the-line model. But the crowd was as silent as a tomb. They weren't just looking at a combine. They were looking at the embodiment of a failed dream. They were looking at a machine that cost too much to buy, too much to run, and too much to fix. The bidding was slow, pathetic. It stalled out at a fraction of its value. The crack of the gavel was a final merciless punctuation mark on the end of Rich Peterson's empire. I didn't go there to gloat. I went for the same reason I'd gone to the Miller auction, to bear witness. But I did have a purpose. When they got to the small items, the tools from his magnificent heated shop, I stepped forward. He had a rolling toolbox, a big red Kennedy, filled with snap-on wrenches and sockets, the best money could buy. I knew he'd bought them one at a time, proud of each piece. I bought the whole setup. I also bought his heavy-duty bench vise and his cutting torch set. I paid more than they were worth, but I wanted them. After the auction was over and the crowds began to drift away, leaving the yard littered with paper cups and shattered hopes, I found Rich. He was just standing there, staring at the empty spaces on the concrete floor of his shop, where his machines used to be. The place already echoed like a tomb. "Rich," I said, my voice quiet. He turned slowly, his eyes hollow. He looked 100 years old. "Come to say, 'I told you so, Earl'?" he asked, his voice a dry rasp. "No," I said. I walked over to the corner where the auctioneer's clerks had put the things I'd bought. "I came to bring you your tools." He stared at me, uncomprehending. "What?" "They're your tools," I said. "A man's got to have his tools. You're going to need them." I pushed the heavy red toolbox toward him. "You can pay me back when you get on your feet. No interest." For a long moment he just stood there, his mouth slightly open. His eyes welled up, and the hard mask of pride he'd worn for so many years finally shattered. He didn't cry, not really, but a single tear traced a path through the grime on his cheek. He nodded, unable to speak. That was all, just a nod. It was more than enough. I also bought the 80 acres, the piece of land that bordered my north fence line, the one he'd paid a king's ransom for during the boom. The bank sold it to me for less than a quarter of that price. I paid cash. The years that followed were lean, but they were good. The community healed slowly. Some families, like Rich's, lost everything and moved away. Others, the ones who had been cautious, who had built their houses on rock instead of sand, survived. The talk at the diner changed. The swagger was gone, replaced by a quiet respect for thrift and a deep suspicion of debt. My old John Deere 95 didn't seem like a museum piece anymore. It looked like wisdom. Men would stop by my shop, hats in their hands, asking for advice on how to rebuild a transmission or where to find a part for an older machine. They didn't call me a dinosaur anymore. They called me for help. Rich and his family moved into a small rental house in town. He got a job driving a truck for the co-op. It was humbling work, but he did it without complaint. Every now and then, he'd stop by my place on a Saturday. He'd bring a six-pack of beer, and we'd work together in my shop, fixing a piece of my equipment. He was a good mechanic when he wasn't stressed to the breaking point. We never talked about the auction, never talked about the bank or the boom years. We talked about engines and weather and the price of soybeans. In the shared language of grease and steel, we found a quiet sort of friendship. Over the course of 5 years, he paid me back for the tools, every last dime. My own son, Michael, grew up watching all of this. He was there in the shop with me the night I rebuilt the combine bearing. He saw Rich Peterson's rise and fall. He learned the lessons not from lectures, but from life. When he was old enough to farm alongside me, he never once asked for a brand new tractor. Instead, he asked me to teach him how to weld. One warm evening in the late 80s, long after the storm had passed, I was standing on that same back porch, watching the sunset. The farm was quiet. Michael was out in the shop, tuning up the old 4020, its familiar diesel rumble a comforting sound. He was getting it ready for spring planting. He'd found a 4-row John Deere Max Emerge planter at a sale, an older model but a good one, and had spent the winter rebuilding it from the ground up. He came out and stood beside me, wiping his hands on a rag. He was a young man, but his hands already had the look of a farmer's hands, calloused and capable. "She's running sweet, Dad," he said. "She always does," I replied. We stood in comfortable silence for a moment, watching the last sliver of orange sun dip below the horizon. The lights on our farm were modest, just a warm glow from the house and a single bulb over the barn door. Across the valley, the farm that had once been Rich Peterson's was now owned by an investment company from Chicago. It was farmed by a custom operator who lived 50 miles away. The massive machine shed stood dark and empty most of the year. It had no life, no soul. It was just an asset on a balance sheet. "Dad," Michael said, his voice serious. I was thinking, that 80 acres you bought from the bank, it's good ground. We could probably handle another 160 on top of that. There's a piece for sale down the road. Maybe we should talk to the bank about a loan. I didn't turn to look at him. I just kept my eyes on the fields, now dark and resting under a blanket of stars. I thought of Tom Miller's haunted face, of Rich Peterson's single tear. I thought of the auctioneer's heartless chant and the cold, dead silence that followed. I thought of my father, his voice rough as a cob, speaking a truth that had been tested by dust and poverty and time. "Son," I said, my voice soft but firm, "let me tell you something my father told me. Never let another man own your sweat. If you can't hold the cash for it in your hand, you can't afford it. Debt is a yoke. It'll feel light at first, but it'll grind you straight into the dirt before you're through." He was quiet for a long time. I could feel him thinking, weighing the allure of expansion against the hard-won wisdom of survival. Finally, he just nodded. "Okay, Dad," he said. "Okay, let's go rebuild that planter instead." And as we walked back toward the warm light of the workshop, I knew. The land was safe, the legacy was secure, the quiet hum of my old paid-for iron would echo here for another generation.